Good morning, everyone. Welcome to 1 Million Cups, and I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving celebration wherever you were. This morning, we have Luke Marshall of VitalFlo. I met Luke about almost a year ago now, at an Exit Event Social when they were just getting started. The idea was there. They were starting to work on the business. Partners were coming together. So it's really wonderful to be able to see the evolution over a year's time and where you're at. Congratulations to the team as well. They were a recent Launch Place Challenge winner. Gave them a little bit of seed money to get started. So we look forward to hearing the story and how we can help. Luke,
Great.
welcome.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm Luke Marshall, CEO of VitalFlo, and excited to be here today to tell you about how we're building a future without asthma attacks with our mobile medical device and analytics platform. I might need a little line of sight to the.
Is that turned on? Great. Yeah. Cool. You just point to me and I'll move.
Ready? Go low tech. Nothing is scarier than being unable to breathe. But sadly, that's the reality for 25 million Americans that suffer from asthma symptoms. This results in 1.6 million trips to the ER every year and will result in 10 deaths today. And all of these trends have been rising since the early 1980s, so almost for 40 years. And why is that? Asthma is a disease that we know how to treat. We have drugs that are effective. We have physicians that know how to prescribe these medications and instruct patients on how to use them. So how on earth is this something that's been getting worse over time? It's because asthma care is broken by bad data. This includes bad compliance with medications by patients, poor access to good quality lung data at home. The devices today are analog and rudimentary. Infrequent access to quality lung data in the lab, once, maybe twice per year. And we're very bad at tracking the environmental triggers that can cause an asthma attack. Asthma is really an N of 1 problem, strongly linked to allergy, which means that what might cause my asthma attack may be something different than what might cause yours. So how do we track these environmental factors like pollution, pollen, ozone exposure that may be triggering for you? And all this leads to anxiety and confusion for patients. So at VitalFlo, we're helping patients know what to expect so that they can breathe easy. And we're doing this with our mobile spirometer. This is a handheld device that links to your smartphone via Bluetooth that a patient exhales forcefully into, and it measures their lung function. It has clinical grade accuracy. It's gone heads up against the lab standard for spirometry, which is the type of device it is. We've made it ultra portable so that patients can take it home and record that data on a daily basis, enabling advanced analytics and trend analysis. And because it's linked to the phone, we know a patient's location, which means we know the environmental exposures that a patient has had, and we can link those trends with their lung health data. So this is all part of VitalFlo's respiratory monitoring system, which is designed to help drive efficiency within the healthcare markets and to improve patient outcomes. And it all starts with daily use of the mobile spirometer, which automatically syncs with our cloud analytics platform. That's also pulling in data about the environmental exposures a patient may have been exposed to. And this enables us to come up with a custom risk factor profile for each patient, essentially saying this is your risk of an asthma attack today. And this information, along with the lung function data, is passed seamlessly to the provider portal through the existing electronic medical record system, so that doctors have access to their patients' data when they need it. And this enables them to make therapeutic recommendations to their patients. So this, at its most basic, would be, hey, today is a 2-puff morning on your inhaler rather than a 1-puff morning. Or this week is a 2-puff week instead of a 1-puff week, because we know that ragweed is coming. So this is a large market. This is one of the big chronic diseases. It's a $50 billion market in the US, and that's driven again by 25 million asthmatics who are suffering from active symptoms. We're focused on the 5 million of those that are persistent severe asthmatics. So this means that they use asthma medication on a daily basis or suffer from asthma symptoms on a daily basis. And to start, we're focused on the 2 million pediatric patients within that cohort. So through combined sales of our mobile device as well as a monthly monitoring fee, this lands us with a $230 per member per year price point, average price point. And this is a model that payers are used to seeing. It's very common for diabetes monitoring as well as cardiac monitoring. So how are we going to capture this substantial opportunity? And we're going to be starting with provider pilots. So this is cohorts of 50 to 100 patients within pediatric and primary care clinics that are part of broader provider networks. By showing that we improve outcomes and drive efficiency within these clinics, we can help expand to the broader provider network, roll it out within that cohort, which obviously helps us onboard additional patients into the system. However, there's startups especially that can get stuck in this sort of death by pilot struggle. So how do we avoid that? So through conversations with other startups that have solved this problem, we're going to be implementing a telemedicine prescription strategy. So this enables us to use online sales that automatically connect patients with a physician that can do a 15-minute consultation, to prescribe the device via video. This will enable us to onboard our own patients, and if we're strategic about where we're recruiting these new patients, that will help us onboard additional provider networks. For example, if we show up to the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which is a big respiratory market, with 2,000 of their patients already onboarded into our system, that conversation happens a lot differently than if we're going in cold. Now, with big groups of patients and provider networks, this helps us roll out the system to insurance payers and wellness programs. And the cycle continues as we bring on those payer programs. We can then roll it out to additional network providers and onboard new patients. It's a nice flywheel effect. So we got a great team. The company was founded by James Diefendorfer, who's the inventor of the VitalFlo device. Recently graduated with his biomedical engineering degree, doctorate from NC State University, where the device was invented. And he's an expert in hardware, embedded code, and machine learning. Robert Chili-Curry, who's here in the audience, is our COO, and he has over 20 years of product development experience, particularly with rapidly scaling hardware manufacturing companies. I myself have been commercializing university-based technologies and building and leading technical teams for the last 8 years. And this team has already put together some great outcomes, including before incorporation, closing on $160,000 in non-dilutive awards that funded the development of the prototype. And during that time, we were also able to complete 90 patients, clinical studies with 90 patients that showed the efficacy of the device. So this was the heads-up study where we put our device against the lab standard and showed that they were just as accurate. Since then, we've incorporated the company earlier this spring. We've executed the exclusive license from NC State University. We've completed the hardware design for manufacturing, as well as the first iteration of the mobile app. And I'm happy to announce, as was alluded, that we've also been successful in raising some additional non-dilutive award funding, including the Big Launch Challenge. And then in the last couple of weeks, learning that we've been recommended for award for our first NSF SBIR Phase 1 grant. It was in this 90-patient clinical study with 160 patient interactions that we learned not only that the device is effective at measuring what we're trying to measure, but also that patients love it. and they were actually disappointed when they weren't able to take it home yet. Through interviews with physicians, we also know that these doctors want this device for their patients. And this enthusiasm has led to now 6 pilot commitments from big regional players at the clinician level, where they want to engage with us either in a clinical study or to roll this out to cohorts of their patients. So why are we here? We were asked to show up with some challenges for the audience, and there's a big one. Epic is a beast. As some of you may know, this is the most broadly used electronic medical record system. It is currently the one that is used by all the big players within our region. UNC Health, Duke Health, Wake Med, UVA, all are on Epic. So this is where we need to be for our electronic medical records integration. So anybody with experience navigating this process, this integration on the back end uses HL7 version 2 to kind of plug into that back end. We may also go through MyChart on the patient's device, but we are certainly seeking advice and help navigating this because we are new to this space, and we know that there's a lot we don't know. So if there are experienced veterans in the room for navigating these systems, I'm positive that we have lots to learn from you. And there are certainly likely to be mistakes that we're making. So with that, I believe I'm roughly at time, so I'll open up for any questions.
And do we have a second mic back there?
It's a pretty big desk. Yeah. I'm pretty important.
Right?
This is where Scott works.
Good morning. This looks like a great product. What struck me is it seems like the secret sauce behind this is partly understanding what's going on where people are in order to come up with that data. And that seems like a real, just very vague about how that all works. Can you explain that maybe in a minute?
Sure. So the location is obviously just from the GPS on your phone. This is one of the advantages of having a phone-tied device. There's some other products out there, peak flow meters that are both analog, some that have gone digital that are not specifically tied to the device. This is why we're strategically trying to pull you into the app, and so that we have that phone GPS location. Based on that, we can actually pull publicly available data on weather and the environment and air quality from available APIs, including airnow.gov, including NOAA, as well as some other proprietary APIs. The Weather Channel has one. There's a lot of environmental triggers that can cause asthma. Some of them are not trivial. It seems kind of obvious, okay, if there's particulate matter in the air, that might cause an asthma attack today, and that's true. If you walk through an area with high pollution, or it happens to be a high pollen day, that can trigger an event today. What's interesting is some of these triggers are not contemporaneous. For example, if you have an ozone exposure, your risk of an asthma attack goes up 6 days later. That's a lot to keep track of for a patient, but it's very easy for a computer to do. So we're pulling this data from publicly available areas. We also expect to be a platform, so it'd be very easy to incorporate additional sensors, home air quality sensors that could give you advice on, hey, today's a day you might want to vacuum or change your air filters. There's a lot of small changes patients can make to drastically improve outcomes that we can help drive.
Over here.
I have a couple of questions. One is, who do you expect to pay for the device? Are you expecting payers, providers, patients who will be paying for this? And second is about the improved outcomes. How are you measuring that improved outcomes? Are you doing some, do you have a ground truth for those patients? Are you doing statistically significant or not? Some comparisons on that.
Those are both great questions. So first, who's going to pay for it? We are definitely seeking a reimbursement model in the long term. That's a bit of a process. So we are going to initially be leveraging the patient to cover the device. as I think I mentioned earlier, we're expecting an average selling price of $100. This is very comparable to similar offerings on the market. The nice thing is our cost structure is one of the best on the market. So we can actually drive our costs way down. So we can drop our prices in certain cases in order to drive adoption on the device end. For the monitoring fee, we drive a lot of value for the provider networks themselves. Frequently, these provider networks already have asthma population management systems in place, replace with a more efficient system where we can help do some of that social work where we see a patient's in trouble, we can help make that connection and make sure that they're coming into the clinic, which is a much more efficient way to drive care as opposed to ending up in the ER or being hospitalized. For HMOs and ACOs, these provider networks are starting to be compensated on a capitated basis, which means that they get a lump flat fee for patient care. In those cases, and this is a more and more common model as we start to shift to value-based care, driving efficiency is a big important thing for these provider networks. So we expect that because they can leverage existing codes for some of the spirometry testing and recoup some of their costs there, the other value will be driven just by these improved efficiency outcomes. So that was the first question. The second question was
About
outcomes. So currently, our clinical studies have been in the clinic setting. So this was patients coming in using the device before and after a different protocol was being tested. And they'd use our device as well as the lab standard, which is the Inspire Coco PFT. Now, you're not going to separate a respiratory professional from their Coco Inspire PFT, but we're not trying to. We're trying to send this home with patients. But to show that we improve clinical outcomes, we need to send this home with patients for extended periods of time. So we are currently in the middle of raising a seed fund, and if there's anybody interested in talking to me about that, we can have an offline discussion of that later. But part of what that seed fund is going to be funding is a 50-patient clinical trial where the patients take it home for 3 months, and we can show that we can improve clinical outcomes. So that is clinical work that remains to be done, but all these factors that we're going to be pulling in are known to drive clinical outcomes. So it stands to reason that by bringing them in and putting some predictive analysis on top of it, that we will be able to show that outcome.
So regarding Epic, are your 6 trials with the regional player a function of being able to negotiate an agreement with Epic, or have they just said it'd be nice, but it's not a showstopper for us?
That's a great question. Several of them would have as a prereq that we want this to flow into the system.
Okay.
Whether or not that needs to be negotiated with Epic directly, or we can do a clever workaround where a patient also has MyChart on their app, and that's already configured for the local institution, and we can push to HealthKit and then get it pulled into MyChart. Yeah. We're looking at workarounds that may not involve a lengthy negotiation because Epic's a beast.
Yeah, Epic's a beast, but
some of the other EMRs where it's truly open. But you can certainly kind of get in there. There's a sandbox, and you can play around with the integrations. There's likely going to be fees that we need to pay in order to actually roll that out. But if we get it to that point, then we should be live with patients, which means we might have some revenue to help cover that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Steve Gates with Trident. This hits home for me because I have family members that do suffer from asthma. My question is, I guess with your team, what are some of the sources for the passion of starting this business in terms of the team as a whole or the founders?
Absolutely. So we have one of our clinical advisors is Dr. Dave Peden. He's the medical director of the ASSIST program at NC State, which is where this technology was developed. He came to James, co-founder, and said, I need this for my clinical practice. Can you build it? And James said, yeah, I can do that because he's really handy with hardware. James suffered from asthma as a kid. He's grown out of it, which is a very common way that this disease progresses. If it's pediatric asthma, many patients end up growing out of their asthma. but he has personal experience with that with him and his family. Robbie, who's here, has several members of his family that suffer from respiratory conditions. I myself have no direct experience with asthma, but I do have a family story that way just because of the improved narrative, but there's a lot of adjacent markets here, and I have family history with those adjacent markets. But yeah, this was originally, the ideation for this process was clinician driven. It was a doctor who came in and said, I need this, can you build it?
Hi, Luke, right here. First of all, a really good presentation for someone who experienced asthma and really has no, not medical background. I followed every slide, so thank you for that. A couple of just two questions, one fairly quick. One is to one of the challenges on the screen there about the interface with Epic. As mentioned, I don't come from a medical background. I come from a different space, but we used third-party companies to build interfaces between systems. And don't know if that exists in the medical world or not. And I'm sure you probably thought of that, but just a thought. The second question really, though, is given the size of the market that you described, the obvious need for a more effective tool for asthma sufferers, what are the barriers to entry from some of the larger, more established medical device companies?
Yeah, and then that's a great question. There are certainly, it's a big market, so there's a lot of players, right? The large players in this space have primarily focused on either the simple analog peak flow meters, which I forgot to do my second pocket reveal. But these are analog devices, roughly have not changed for the last 40 years. If you look at it, there's a little dial here. When you exhale forcefully, it basically moves the needle. It works a lot like the pressure gauge on your car tire, because that's basically the technology. Very rudimentary. You set up these dials on the side to show you if you're in the red, yellow, or green zone. It's very easy to perform this procedure incorrectly. And patients fake it all the time and get the wrong results. This is basically clinically useless data. And this is made by Philips. So the peak flow market in the US is about $300 million. And that's just for these guys. There are certainly some of them moving into the more digital space. And what they're typically doing is digitizing that and coming up with some rudimentary version of an app. It's not an incorporated startup by the pharma companies. There's kind of two waves of startups. The first one was with smart connected inhalers. So this would be a device that to the physiology. And now there's a second wave of startups of which we are part that is doing the outputs. This is your actual lung health today and the physiological response. Within these startups, there's a couple that are larger and a couple that are smaller. There's a few different strategies. I'd say that the biggest barrier to entry really isn't the incumbents. The biggest barrier to entry is trying to navigate these we're on the path, correct.
In terms of an exit strategy, I'm assuming you have one. And thinking about Epic and putting a few things together, why would they not want to have you integrated and potentially buy you, even though you are a little bit of a hardware company. At the end of the day, you're going to be a data company that's part of an overall system. So to me, that would be a no-brainer. But what do I know? I'm not a scientist or a doctor, and I don't play one on TV.
No, that was kind of a two-part question.
Yeah, well, you're certainly right that that we are in the long run angling to be more of a data company. We want to be in a platform where to get really personalized data sets. We can also pull in third-party data that might contribute to our analysis, such as respiratory rate and pulse rate and these kinds of things that you can pull off of devices like this. So you're right that we're a data company. I don't know that that Epic would necessarily be one of our acquirers, just because they are such a behemoth in the space that they're in, which is the medical record system, that they certainly would have an interest in us plugging into them if we reach a certain scale, because we'd be making them more sticky for the providers themselves that like us. So we certainly want them to see us as a partner, but because they are the 800-pound gorilla, we need to be slightly larger than a mouse before they kind of notice us, on the bottom of their shoe or whatever. So they certainly are a long-term partner for us, and we expect them to take us seriously as we grow. But I don't know that they would be the actual acquirer.
So they you think might be strategically then?
Yeah, so strategically, for acquisitions, there's some interesting companies in the tech space. For example, Nokia is now completely digital health, which you wouldn't have expected from them being the leader in cell phones, just a decade ago. Google has made some acquisitions in this space. They're less in the hardware space. So that's just on the tech side. We certainly do see opportunity with the traditional medical device conglomerates. While they may not have the internal expertise to stand up a digital health business unit by themselves, they could certainly stand one up, basically buy an existing business structure and put that within their portfolio, because most of these companies are conglomerates. In addition to that, from a strategic side, insurance companies all have VC wings now. They probably, for the same reasons that Epic wouldn't, they probably wouldn't be an acquirer, but they could certainly be a strategic investor. And they're starting to even roll out programs like this. I've had a conversation with Blue Cross Blue Shield where there's an incentive program that if you wear your Fitbit and you hit your 10,000 steps 80% of the days, that you get a kickback on your premium. That would be an amazing model for both us and them to implement for their asthmatic patients, because an uncontrolled asthmatic costs payers $6,500 per year, and a controlled asthmatic costs payers less than $2,500 per year. So for them to pay us $230 to save $4,000 is a win-win for everybody. And if they can incent their patients by giving small kickbacks for compliance, all the better. So they could be a strategic.
I just want to know what your current profit margin is for each unit sold.
So we're pre-FDA, so we're not selling units. Our expected profit margin when we initially go to market would be 60% on the hardware. That can easily be driven down to 80% at scale based on our cost structures. On the software side, we expect to have kind of traditional SaaS profit margins, and which all depends on how much of the SG&A you pull into that number. But that would range somewhere between 70 and 80% margins.
Again, Luke, I think great job in terms of giving us the information. You already answered part of my question, which was where do you go next? And the COPD is what I was thinking about, and cystic fibrosis is certainly another great use of that technology. But you also talked about, and I think you guys understand you have to crawl before you can walk.
Yes.
And I respect that, and I think that's great. But when you talk about a type 2 device, the device itself, I agree, is type 2. But where you might cross the line, and I don't know how you're marketing at this point, is that Internet of Things, that artificial intelligence piece where you are prescribing, only take one hit or two.
Yep.
you're not in the type 2 device world there, and I'm
Correct.
sure you know that.
Yep.
How are you going to deal with that? Because that's such a critical value of the way you described this.
Right. So that's a strong reason why we're definitely interested in engaging with the clinician at the outset. So right now, those instructions would only ever come from the clinician in the current setup. In the long term, we would likely need to do a PMA because there's not predicates that are able to do this yet. Just the technology has never been there before where you could have a device self-closing that loop. The PMA process is a much longer process than the 510K that requires, that actually requires clinical trials. The 510K process does not require clinical trials, which is why we can be on such a fast track. So we're certainly looking at that in the long term, but we want to get to market, both to just get to market and start selling devices, but also because that helps us build our data set that's going to make that predictive ability even stronger. This is one of those plays that the better, the more robust the user base, the more the algorithm basically gets to learn. So it's it learns over time and improves over time based on more users and users using it more often. So that's in the long-term pipeline for sure, but we're avoiding that by looping in the doctor and only having the doctor make the recommendations at the moment.
Hi, good presentation. I was wondering whether you had thought about weight loss and metabolism, because I saw Healthy Diets in Raleigh was using something less developed product, but I think there's needs improvement, so you might want to expand there.
Yeah, and actually there's a very strong link between obesity and asthma, where obese people are much more likely to suffer from asthma. And this is one of those applications where bringing in third-party learnings into that data set, whether that's from a Withings device that syncs to Apple Kit, Apple Health Kit, that we pull in as part of our analytics to help inform the algorithm and predictive ability of the software. We're certainly looking at what are these co-modalities that might inform everything.
I've been great. My professor, the same thing you guys did. But the issue we had, I'm saying, I noticed you only have an allergy doctor. You don't have a pulmonary doctor. You know what I'm saying? Yep. Why you don't have a pulmonary doctor? You know what I'm saying? That's designing. If you look at the sleep machine, I was in the 80s. I was the one who put the sleep machine in and worked with people COPD with pediatric. But what I noticed, you don't have a pulmonary doctors, and we had challenges. We had to have a pulmonary doctor because you need to have your entitled CO2 reading. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. All those things need to have, because you have an allergy doctor right here, and the pH, he only does the pH. You know what I'm saying, for kids. And I did pediatric for a very long time, and the challenge is it was kid. Okay, when it comes to what I'm asking, we're trying to cut that to lower the cost. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And we're putting that into implementation because our system for the healthcare has been designed for billing.
Yeah.
You might want to look into blockchain and artificial intelligence, you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And why are you building on that platform? You know what I'm saying? I understand you want to build on Epic. Epic is just for medical records, for the data medical record. Why are you building on that? You know what I'm saying? You should be thinking about getting into blockchain and artificial intelligence. Because the issue what we had, you know what I'm saying, we design the stuff. You know what I'm saying? We would design the stuff. The issue what we had, the doctors who go in, even our stuff is reading right. And the challenges we had, it was the doctors. The doctors can go back and change that. That's why we're trying to do blockchains. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
For that. You might want to move your step ahead in that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we've actually had conversations with investors about building on a blockchain platform. That's something where I'd have to self-profess some ignorance on. but we do think there's a lot of interesting opportunity there. And there's a lot of interesting downstream effects that can be interesting to monetize here. So for example, if after visiting the same building, 5 people have asthma attacks within a couple days, that's probably something that the Department of Health and Human Services should know about because there's probably a mold problem in that building. So there's interesting public health ways to potentially monetize this data after it's been anonymized that blockchain may be able to help with. In terms of engaging with the respiratory physicians directly, the boots on the ground, so to speak, are the pediatric and primary care physicians, but they do get referred up to the respiratory specialists quite frequently. So we've engaged our 2 folks that the pediatricians refer up when they can't solve the case. And we actually have interesting engagement from all levels of the all different specialties within the medical profession, being that the pediatricians don't necessarily, they basically do simple cases of asthma. Okay, let's take a look at your expiratory flow, and let's look at, are you on Advair? And if it's more complicated, that usually gets referred up the chain, and that's where spirometry would traditionally be implemented. So what we're able to do is basically collect the spirometry along the way so that information can be passed back and forth and help with the diagnosis.
Luke, we have time for 2 more questions. Yeah, right here, and then we'll come to you, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
I'll try to keep it short. Thank you. First of all, let me say it was an excellent presentation, and it's a very interesting product that you have there, especially since I just spent my weekend with it. My new daughter-in-law was a pretty bad asthmatic, and we just spent Thanksgiving weekend with her. So I think you can do a lot of good. Very quick question. I think you sort of touched on it, but it looked like your business model was to go on and sell individual units, which you charge $230 a year for. Have you thought about 2 other possible markets? One would be to other pharmaceutical companies developing asthmatic drugs to help them with their clinical trials. They might be able to pay $1,000 or $5,000 per patient to gather that data because their clinical trials cost a hell of a lot of money. That might be a nice business model for you. Secondly, environmental studies. I mean, can you use this to back calculate and look at certain areas that might be prone to causing asthma attacks, and there might be other money in it for you for the EPA and things like that?
Yeah, those are great suggestions. We certainly have looked at getting into the clinical trial market. Tiva is a member of Assist, and they have engaged with Assist about getting a trial set up for their next product. So we made a little pitch to maybe be thrown in with that clinical trial. So we'll see how that goes. We've engaged with some other players in the space as well. But that's certainly an interesting adjacent market that we are looking to engage with. With the environmental studies, we've also had preliminary discussions with RTI International. That is, they have a wearable, basically personal environment detector. It's kind of a pendant. It's a little bulky, but the principle is that I can basically measure the air quality right around my person, as opposed to trying to triangulate it from these big sources. That study we may be able to also join and basically see that correlation effect. Whether we'd be the standalone device that back calculates studies to show this adverse effect, because asthma is one of those things that's super common and doesn't get a lot of play because it's so common, and people don't realize that 1 in 12 Americans has asthma. That's that's something that we should be addressing.
Okay, disaster relief funding, do you go after that? And the Healthy Home Program?
The Healthy Home Program. There's a Building Performance Institute out of the Pacific Northwest that did a study on this and what it saves on emergency rooms, and actually has the insurance companies paying for some of that stuff. So you should look at the BPI and just look at the disaster relief funding that may be able to subsidize after a hurricane, anything like that.
Rick, are you going to be around for a few?
Yeah, I'll talk. It's fine.
Great.
All right, last question.
First of all, admirable way to spend your working hours, and I applaud you for that. Have you thought about launching in other countries where maybe the regulatory barriers aren't quite as high?
We have thought about that. So we looked into the two big markets for this space are China and India. In India, for example, there's 60 million. Also, very little reliance. Patients have a strong incentive to avoid going to the doctor. So we can actually roll out more pieces of the system, kind of what we were talking about before. Here we need to do a PMA. There, that's actually a benefit to roll out the learning ahead of time. There's a couple challenges to going overseas. Mostly it's the cost structure. Now we have a big advantage here because we can lower our costs quite significantly, I think, compared to our competitors. But just to get in the game in India, we need to be selling a device for $15 equivalent. We expect that we could probably get there at large scale, but at the beginning we'd be taking a loss on that, which isn't to say that we shouldn't be there. But we would want to reach a certain scale to make sure that we stay profitable when we pursue those markets. We can also, there is much less requirements in terms of like an FDA equivalent in India, for example. But if we are exporting to India, we have to be FDA cleared. So we're definitely looking at that. We're probably going to step through the FDA here first before we do that expansion. But that could easily be part of how we get to rapid scale quickly is to start shipping over there.
I know we're going to be done. I'm taking spots with you. You know a lot. It's a great presentation. You have all the answers to all the questions. The problem is we can't help you unless you have problems. And I've been seeing problems in your conversation. So in the future, just try to jump in with more listening or what the issues are that you're really challenged with, not what you know, because we all know you know a lot.
Sure.
And it's good, but just future thinking.
Great. Thanks.
All right, Luke. Unfortunately, the time is up. Thank you very much.
Great job.
How many of the many who are here